Hi, everyone. We're now letting folks in from the waiting room. We'll get started in just a few moments. As you're all entering the room, I'd like to invite anyone that needs to enable their live transcript. That is turned on our side. And if you need it on your end, you'll be able to do that in your Zoom settings. We will get started in just a moment. Thank you all for joining us. I do also want to take this time to let everyone know that the Q&A will be at the end of the presentation and you'll be able to drop questions in the chat feature. I'd now like to introduce Lynn Lasher for our introduction of Stan, the intro to the intro. Lynn is from our Daytimers Committee. Take it away.
Last year, Daytimers had Dr. Stan Schatt speak to us about an imaginary Jewish family living in 2050 called the Jet Skis. Today, we are again honored to have him back take us on a journey through time and space as we look at how humanity is evolving. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stan Schatt.
Well, thank you very much. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to take a journey through time and space. We're going to go back to our relatives, the Neanderthals, and go far into the future when we don't even look like we do now, probably. And what I'm going to do, in effect, is create a intellectual gumbo. So next, it's going to have a pinch of neuroscience, a dollop of cutting-edge genetics, just a tablespoon on the latest anthropology with particular attention to the latest research on Neanderthals. Next. If this is possible, a painless dose of quantum physics. We're going to look at time and the nature of time. Next. And a dab of Jewish and Christian theology with some discussion of the Kabbalah. Finally, a helping of paranormal research. We're going to look at some research being done at one of America's major medical schools. Next. So more specifically, here's what we're going to cover. Next. We're going to take a closer look at our cousins, the Neanderthals, and I think you're going to discover that they actually were a lot further up in terms of their hierarchy of needs than we might have assumed. Next. We're going to take a journey through ancient Egypt and look at their concept of life after death, look at the Middle Ages, the Kabbalah, and death as a part of life's journey. And then we're going to take a spiritual journey and look on the latest research on near-death experiences and reincarnation. Next. We're going to see some pretty firm evidence that evolution has not stopped for humanity. Next. And we're going to talk about the latest research on uploading ourselves to computers, the use of gene editing CRISPR, and what it might mean to be human in the future. And finally, we're going to take a look at humanity's voyage through space and different dimensions in terms of what a quantum universe might mean. Next. So many of you are old enough to remember the old Ben Casey show on TV, and it always began with these symbols: man, woman, life, death, infinity. And what we're going to do is to look at that and look at the concept of whether or not our journey is really linear or it might even be cyclical. So that's what we're going to examine. Next. Paul Gauguin was in debt. He was ill. He was mourning the death of his favorite daughter. And he spent a month working on this painting. And when he finished, he said it was the best painting he ever did, and it was comparable to the gospel. And he would never write a better, or never paint a better picture. When he finished it, he scrolled those words on the painting. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Now, we could spend a lot of time on the painting. I just want to point out a few things. You'll notice the little baby who's just arrived here, presumably. Notice the two women next to the baby who are, they have their hands on their chins and they're kind of studying the baby and thinking, thinking about it. We have a woman who is looking up and seems to be praying to somebody up there. In the background on the left, you see a Polynesian statue that is associated with the afterlife. And then finally, a couple things. You see an old woman who presumably is contemplating her upcoming death. And then there's a bird there that has, you can't see it, but the bird has a lizard in its mouth. And that, according to Gauguin, symbolizes the futility of words compared to painting. Next. So let's take a look at our beginnings. Our cousins, the Neanderthals. Now, Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist, looked at a skeleton and she saw a femur bone that had been broken and later healed. And she said that that was evidence to her of civilization. The reason is that she said animals that injure themselves like that never survive in the wild. That when you're injured, and she also found skeletons from the Neanderthals that indicated that the person had been blind in one eye, another one had a broken arm, another one was deaf in one ear. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So what Mead said is that civilization is when you care for those who can't care for themselves and you protect them. And to her, that is a hallmark of civilization. Next slide. So when we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the idea is psychological needs, you need, and physiological needs, you need to fulfill each step as you move up to the next step. We usually, nope, there we go. We usually associate Neanderthals with the first two levels, physiological needs and safety needs, trying to survive. But they may go a little higher up on the hierarchy, if you give me the next slide. This is pretty interesting. It turns out that 176,000 years ago, there's a cave in Brunico, France. And scientists have discovered that Neanderthals dragged 2 tons of rocks 330 meters into the cave, or I'm sorry, 330 yards into the cave. And they constructed this massive circular structure with the rocks, with stalagmites, that's 22 feet in diameter. And in the middle, apparently they burned things. And according to these same scientists, anthropologists, they believe that that's a sign of transcendence. That is a concern for perhaps what happens after life. So it's a very early symbol. And this is 76,000 years before our ancestors, the Cro-Magnons, came along. Next slide. Again. So the Neanderthals loved color, so they had an aesthetic sense. Here's a cave in which they have used the color red to paint the entire wall. And you'll notice there is a handprint there from 176,000 years ago, which is kind of fascinating. Next. Here is a bone necklace that has been discovered, and apparently a Neanderthal artist created this work of art for a comely Neanderthal woman. Next slide. Now, another human trait, of course, is aggression. We have found skeleton evidence of a mixture of Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal skeletons with their skulls bashed in, a sign that the relatives were fighting with each other. And in fact, the Neanderthals were pretty fierce warriors. We believe that they managed to keep our ancestors from migrating from Africa to Northern Europe for tens of thousands of years because they were so fearsome. Eventually, our superior technology won out. Next slide. Now, another characteristic early on that humanity shares is tribalism. Us versus them. It turns out that the derivation of the word barbarian in Greek means not Greek, not one of us. And tribes were very small. The Neanderthals were basically between 5 and 10 in a tribe. So you definitely knew who your people were, and everyone else was them. Next slide. So as far as tribalism goes, teenagers have a way of depicting themselves as member of the same tribe so they can recognize each other. Next one. And in our polarized climate politically, as you can see, people dress a certain way, and that basically is distinguishing themselves. Next slide. We carry our genes within us. We carry our history within us. It turns out that we have between 1% and 3% Neanderthal genes. And we now believe that these genes are associated with a number of characteristics. So for example, they've been linked to depression, to propensity to get COVID, to whether you're a night owl, a number of other things. By the way, I put together a very detailed bibliography of URL links, and those are going to be mailed to you. And so if you're interested in any of these topics, they're all characterized. You can go through and find out a lot more information. Next slide. Well, some of us even carry genes from 2 recent additions to our family tree, the Denisovan and dragon men ancestors. And these are, obviously we don't have pictures, these are facial reconstructions of what we believe they look like. Interestingly enough, the guy on the right could be an MMA fighter today and would fit right in probably. Next slide. Now, physically, we weren't that different from the Neanderthals. We didn't have a ridge in our forehead. We weren't as broad in the shoulder. But physically, we were not that different. In fact, there are examples of hybrids, examples of Cro-Magnon men who had apparently mated with female Neanderthals. So we were actually able to do that. But the difference is our spiritual journeys. Next slide. The Neanderthals buried their dead in very shallow graves, covered them, and then put rocks on them, presumably to keep them from wild animals. The Cro-Magnon were much more elaborate in their ceremonies. We know that they buried their dead with their tools and weapons, which suggests that they had some thought of an afterlife. Also, we have evidence that they played a little flute instrument when they buried somebody. Next slide. The Cro-Magnon expressed their dreams and their prayers on elaborate paintings, as you can see here. And the artist here is a far better artist than I ever will be. Next slide. And again, we even have evidence that the Cro-Magnon worshipped a kind of very primitive fertility goddess, as you can see here. Next slide. Now, There was a time 25,000 to 35,000 years ago when the Neanderthals and the Cro-Magnon existed in the same time in the same place. Jean Ahl covers this in a series of books she wrote about the period. And her most famous is called The Clan of the Cave Bear. And it's about a Neanderthal tribe that adopts a female Cro-Magnon baby and brings her to adulthood, and then the clash of civilizations between the two. It's well worth reading. What is not worth your time, next slide, is a grade B movie with Daryl Hannah starring as the woman from the cave of the clan bear, the clan of the cave bear. Next slide. Again. One of my favorite writers is a Canadian science fiction writer by the name of Robert J. Sawyer. He actually wrote a trilogy known as the Neanderthal Paradox. And what he imagines is a gateway opening between our current world, which is ruled by Cro-Magnon, and another world where the Neanderthals prevailed and now are scientists and modern, but they never abandoned their hunter-gatherer society. So he talks about the clash of civilizations when the two meet. And it's well worth reading. It's in the bibliography. Next. So I'm going to ask a series of questions for myself that I'll answer, hopefully, during the talk. And one question, which may seem strange to you, is, are we really evolving in a positive direction? Now, why should we say that? Well, next slide. Jared Diamond, who's a very well-known UCLA anthropologist, written a number of books, he says that the movement from hunter-gatherer to an agrarian society is history's biggest fraud. Why would he say that? Next slide. Okay, well, it turns out when we look at skeletons from the end of the Ice Age and compare them with that of classical Greek and Turkish times, the ancient hunter-gatherers had superior health compared to the early farmers. Next slide. Better nutrition, less starvation, less disease. Wait a second. It turns out that the men in the end of the Ice Age averaged 5'9" in height, and the women averaged 5'5". Now, by the time we get to classical Greece, the men and women in that part of the world averaged 5'3", and the women averaged 5 feet. So why? Well, when you're an agrarian society, you're relying on certain crops, and they don't give you everything you need in terms of nutrition. The hunter-gatherers had more protein and a better balanced diet. Also, they didn't live in cities, so they weren't crowded together, and they didn't live with their animals. So for those reasons, they had a lot less disease. Next. And this one I think is fascinating. It turns out that hunter-gatherers are pretty egalitarian in terms of their society. Everyone has roles, they share the food equally, apparently, and so forth. When you move to an agrarian society, land becomes very important. You have to own the land, you have to cultivate the land, you have to protect the land. So what happened was women became stuck in a subservient role. They became basically baby machines because you needed a lot of sons to till the land. Also, it created class differences because the people who owned the land became wealthier than those who simply tilled it. And we have skeletal evidence that kings and queens from that time had much better nutrition than those who weren't. Also, when you own land, you have to protect it. And so there were a lot of wars over who owns the land. Next. And as I mentioned earlier, the people in Greece and Turkey still haven't caught up with their stature-wise with their hunter-gatherer ancestors, although they're getting close. Next. Now, we have actually studied Bushmen. We've studied primitive tribes in Brazil. And what we discovered is that they don't spend that much time hunting, gathering. They spend an average of 19 hours a week. The rest of the time, they relax. So one hunter-gatherer was asked why he didn't plant crops. And his answer was, there are plenty of nuts on the tree. Why should I work that hard? Next. Okay. So if we take a look again at this Maslowian hierarchy of needs chart, we're going to look at it a slightly different way. Next slide. We have additional needs that we now find Cro-Magnon very much concerned about. There's esteem needs, cognitive needs, they want to learn more, aesthetic needs, self-actualization and transcendence we'll talk about a little more further on. But we're moving on up. Next slide. Jodi Picoult is an interesting novelist. It turns out that her son went to college and decided to study Egyptology. Okay. So she decided, as a good mother, she better learn as much as she can about Egyptology. So she did a deep dive. And after she did that, she wrote a novel called The Book of Two Ways. Now, she focused on a very interesting characteristic of ancient Egyptian society. Next. Okay, and one more next, together with it there. So it turns out that the Egyptians painted their coffins with very, very elaborate maps of the journey in the afterworld. Now, as we know from King Tut's tomb and so forth, the Egyptians buried all kinds of objects with individuals with the idea that they would need them in the next world. But it turns out it's a very precarious journey. This shows all the pitfalls they have to avoid. Eventually they make it to a temple of life and death, where Osiris judges them to find out what's going to happen to them in the afterworld. If they're judged worthy, their life will be very pleasant, much like their life in Egypt. If not, they go through all kinds of torments. Next slide. Now, when we get to the Middle Ages, it turns out that the Christians were very much preoccupied with the idea of the afterlife. For one thing, starting at birth, there was a lot of people who died. So birth was a very dangerous sort of thing. It turns out that most of the days were named after saints. And so you had saints' days, which are associated with martyrs who died terrible deaths. From the time they're born, people are thinking about heaven and a better world, and they know they have to be very good in order to make it to heaven. Also, they're surrounded by death because of the plague in the Middle Ages. And as Martin points out, medicine and medical care were very bad during the Middle Ages. A lot of people died. And then also, it turns out that the church sold indulgences. Now, what that means is that people could buy, by paying the church money, they could buy less time for their loved ones who had died in purgatory. So once again, made them think about death, about the afterworld. What about us Jews? Next slide. Well, growing up Reform, my rabbis never talked much about life after death. When someone died, they always said, well, the person is alive as long as they're in your thoughts, and so forth. And it turns out we now believe that part of Jewish writing has been very much colored, religious writing, by our experience in Egypt. The Egyptians were obsessed with death. What's interesting is if you look at the Torah, priests are forbidden from even touching dead people. So it's just the opposite. Now in the Talmud and the Midrash, we do have a little evidence of life after death. We have, for example, Samuel being raised from the dead a year after he died. So at least there's some comment about it. But where we really find a lot of information is in the Kabbalah. Next slide, particularly the Zohar. So in the Zohar, it turns out there are various phases that we go through when we die. And I think it's kind of interesting. Next. Okay. The first stage is the pangs of the grave. This is the very painful separation that the soul goes through, separating from the human body. And what I think is fascinating is we're told that during this period of time, the body, the spirits goes through a very hard time. The more materialistic a person was during life, the harder time they have at death. So what's fascinating is there seems to be a link between this and the custom we have of sitting Shiva. Now we're told when we sit Shiva, it's a community thing to help a loved one get over, the death of somebody, but it may have been associated originally with the idea that we're comforting the soul that is suffering, trying to rid itself of the body. Next. Next stage is an emotional purification stage, kind of getting rid of the remnants of material body. Next. Then there becomes a awareness of the transcendent. Next. And then a return to the source or to the divine. Now that's usually the end for most of us. Reform Judaism focuses on the spirit, but there's some evidence in Orthodox prayers that there is going to be a reunification of body and soul at the end of days. Next slide. Go back one. There, okay. So most people, we're told, the spirits will wait around till the end and then they'll be reunified with the body. But in the Zohar, it actually says that some people didn't learn enough in this lifetime and they will be subject to reincarnation, go through the classroom once again. Okay, next. I thought there was a fascinating parallel, believe it or not, between the first stage of death, pangs of the grave, and a type of meditation that Buddhist priests go through called Thugsden. What they're able to do is to meditate at such a deep level that they slow their body's processes so that they're barely alive. Now, what is really interesting, and it's in the bibliography, is a study that was done of these priests when they die. What they discovered was that it could take up to 3 weeks for their body to start decaying, whereas for most of us, it starts 2 or 3 hours after we die. So it's kind of an interesting factoid. Next. The most fascinating book dealing with this medieval concept of death and life after death updated is by Jane Jensen, called Dante's Equation, and it's in the bibliography. But she looks at what if the Jews were right, medieval Jews? What if there was a very elaborate system set up? And what if it was linked to modern physics and quantum physics in terms of what happens to us? Parallel universes where people go based on just how good they were during life. And it's a very interesting novel. I recommend it highly. Next. I'm going to raise another question now. Maybe humanity's journey is not linear from birth to death. Next. Raymond Moody was fascinated, do the next one too, please. Yeah, with Plato. And so he was fascinated with the story of Er, who's a warrior who died and went through a process where he came back 10 days later. Next, there's one more there. And it describes a cave and a light at the end of the cave. Essentially, it describes a near-death experience. So next. So he wrote a book called Life After Life, and he outlines the stages of a near-death experience. You know, you hear the news that you're dead, you become aware you're dead, there's peace and quiet. Next. There's a noise all of a sudden. Next. There's a dark tunnel with a light at the end. Next. You have an out-of-body experience. You become aware that your body's down there and you're up here. Next. You meet others. Next, including spiritual beings. Your life is judged. Next. Next, there's a border between life and death. You're told you need to go back. Next. So you do come back. Next. You tell others about your experience. Next. It affects them. It affects you. You have a new view of death. You're never afraid of death again. Next. You've all heard of Elisabeth Kubler-Ross from her book on death and dying. She also wrote a book on life after death. And she sat at the bedside of lots and lots of people who died, and some of who had near-death experiences. And this is her conclusion. Next. She says, death is the final stage of growth in this life. There is no total death. Only the body dies. The self or the spirit, or whatever you may wish to label, is eternal. You may interpret this any way that makes you comfortable. Next. Well, in 1956, The Search for Bridie Murphy was a bestseller. And I probably should have included it in my bestseller class. And it was made into a movie. Here's a poster. But there's a lot of bad movies Hollywood made about reincarnation. Next, here's one. Next. I've lived before. You might want to avoid this one, especially the suit the guy's wearing. Next. Next slide. The University of Virginia Medical School, which is very well respected, has a division of perceptual studies, and it is actually focused on doing scientific analysis of people who experience near-death experiences. And it looks at the biological possibilities. It looks at psychological, all kinds of possibilities. And they're doing very serious work in this area. Next. Here's another thought. Maybe humanity's out-of-body experience is more physical than spiritual. Maybe we simply move beyond our physical bodies and become cyber humans. Next. So Julian Huxley in 1957 coined the phrase transhumanism, going beyond what man is now, augmenting ourselves. Next. Nice Jewish man by the name of Ray Kurzweil, who has a number of patents to his name, believes that the singularity is coming. The singularity is when computer intelligence outstrips human intelligence. He says if we do not augment ourselves and become one with computers, we'll be left in the dust. He wrote this book, which was a bestseller. He takes around 200 pills a day because he wants to live long enough to be able to upload his consciousness and live forever. Argument is we're already doing some of this. Next. Here's a woman with two thumbs on the same hand because she has an artificial thumb she sends signals to wirelessly through her brain waves to make it work. We have a man who has artificial arms. He can move through his mind sending signals. We have a woman with a cochlear implant. So we've augmented ourselves biologically. Next. And this is the concept of uploading your consciousness. You basically take the body right after death, you slice and dice the brain, and you upload the consciousness to a computer or a robot. Next. Best book on the subject, serious book, is the one on the left. It's in the bibliography. There's a very, very good comic series on Amazon called Upload, where it turns out that for a fee, you can upload someone's consciousness when they dies to what amounts to a country club where they live forever. Next. Serious research being done. Nectomy won a large grant. They have taken the nervous system of a pig. They have frozen it. They have unfrozen it. And then under an electron microscope, you can still see the synapses. Next. Another company, Carbon Copies, is doing whole brain emulation. Next. And here's some of their recent posts. If a simulated fire can't burn wood, how can a simulation? Would an upload be me or just a copy of me? It talks about Chinese room thought experiments. That's whether computers really are intelligent and understand human thought. And brain health. Next. There's an Amazon movie for everything. Here's a TV series called Altered Carbon, where a person says that they just shed their skin, shed their body like a snake sheds its skin, because human consciousness has been digitized. Next. Best novel on the subject is this 850-page book by Neil Stevenson called Fall or Dodge in Hell, which gives a pretty good idea of what it would be like if you had your consciousness uploaded. Next. This is kind of an interesting thing. If you've ever gone to a Fortune 500 website, you probably have a little box that pops open and it says, "Can I help you? Do you have any questions?" And it talks. That's a chat bot. Okay. Well, researchers at MIT are looking at the possibilities in the near future where people spend so much time online that you could take all of their digital information, their blogs, their tweets, whatever, Facebook comments, and you could collect those digitally. Next. You could create a neural network, and with the neural network, you actually could update it. So when you update it, you could include all kinds of information about relatives who might have been born or died after this person died. You could talk about current events so that the whole consciousness keeps growing. Next. Yeah. So the idea is eventually there would be enough there that you could have what would appear to be a conversation with a dead loved one. Can you imagine the fun at Thanksgiving time when you have political discussions? So next. Okay, here's another question. Even though we're trying to get past our physical bodies, maybe we're still evolving physically. Next. Well, it turns out when you're a fetus, you have this you have this artery, which basically provides blood to the hand and arm. It disappears as an adult for most people when you just have a radial and a ulnar artery. But in 30% of, well, it turns out that at the end of the 19th century, 10% of people had this to adulthood. Today, it's 30%. And scientists estimate that in another 80 years, virtually everyone will have this. We don't see what good it does, but we're getting it. Next. Next slide, there, again. Okay, a lot of babies today are being born without wisdom teeth so they'll never grow out. That's because we may not need them. It's like we don't need tails. Next. Turns out people with sickle cell anemia have resistance to this horrible fever called Lassa fever, and some resistance to malaria. So as bad as sickle cell anemia is, it clearly had evolved to provide a certain benefit. Next. Now this is fascinating. It turns out there are evolutionary changes still taking place in what we think and how we feel about each other. It turns out men and women, when they're given tests, prefer symmetrical faces. Next. Women can smell the scent of men who are more symmetrical. Now, they're not conscious of this, but in tests, they choose the ones. Next. They can differentiate between men with immune systems. They tend to go with immune systems of men who are different than their own to broaden the gene pool, apparently. Next. Tall men rated more attractive. Women rated more attractive tend to have more children, according to studies. Next. Well, man, this is bad news. We've been losing genes on the Y chromosome. We eventually may lose the entire Y chromosome. The only thing to keep in mind is there's a creature called the mole vole. The mole vole has managed to reproduce itself even after its Y chromosome disappeared. Next. 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, milk farming came to Northern Europe. The Danes and the Swedes are able to handle lactose. It came later to Africa and Asia. Most of them can't handle milk today. And as you know, a lot of our Eastern European relatives also have lactose intolerance. Next. During the most fertile part of their menstrual cycle, women are attracted to men with more masculine faces. The rest of the time, they like sensitive men with more feminized features. Next. A lot of that information comes from this book by Scott Solomon, Future Humans, Continuing Evolution. Okay, go ahead. Got some bullet points here. He talks about increases in genetic mutations, a fascinating chapter on changes in bacteria in our guts. It turns out the more urbanized we get, the less variance we have in our bacteria. And the more antibiotics we take, that also affects our guts. Next. He points to environmental damage to our genes. Next. Now, one counter evolutionary trend is the fact that online dating allows people to meet people that never would have met before. So it kind of broadens the amount of people. I have a colleague who's a futurist, and he basically has created evolutionary paths we're likely to go to in the future. It's in the bibliography. I just want to touch on a couple. Next. Next. He says the humans who don't change are going to be Luddites, Homo sapiens luditus. He says we can optimize ourselves. We can become cyber humans. We can become more robot, more machine than human, and so forth. And it's an article well worth reading. Next. Well, here's another thought. Humans now have tools to alter our own evolutionary path. Next. The Code Breaker, I recommend highly, talks about gene editing. It's a subject of great interest to a lot of people. Next. For example, last year's Nobel Prize winner, Kazuo Ishiguro, has a book about a robot, but it also includes humans who have been augmented. Machinehood by S.P. Divya, a very good female Indian writer, also talks about augmented humans. Next. The big concern has to do with designer babies. The idea is that if parents have a choice, they're going to opt for giving their future offspring the best advantage they can. And it raises all kinds of ethical issues that Isaacson discusses in his book. Next. Well, you can't really count on humans following the ethical guidelines. It turns out one biotech startup is actually doing gene therapy on dementia patients and not waiting for not obeying the appropriate safeguards. Next. Here's another thought. Maybe the human journey goes beyond linear or circular. It could be multidimensional. Well, next slide. Sir Isaac Newton said, "Arrow goes straight as the time goes straight as an arrow." Next. Albert Einstein said that time's relative. Next. He said, when you're courting a nice girl, an hour seems like a second. When you sit on a red hot cinder, a second seems like an hour. That's relativity. Next. So here's a parody of Nude descending a staircase, because Einstein said that time space is the fourth dimension and it's unchanging. So the idea is if you looked at ducks going along or women going down you would see all of them, past, present, and future, because they're all there at the same time. Next. Einstein had trouble with quantum physics. Quantum physics had trouble with Einstein. The two theories just don't mesh. Next. Carlo Rovelli, who's a modern physicist, he says there's no such thing as past or future. Okay, it's just how we think about it. Next slide. So maybe Emily Dickinson was onto something when she said forever is composed of nows. Next. Max Tegberg is a very well-known MIT physicist, and he puts it all very clearly. He says, you can either portray reality as a three-dimensional place where stuff happens over time, or a four-dimensional space where nothing happens over time. And if it really is the second picture, reality is an illusion. There's nothing changing. It's all just there. Next. So in effect, our lives are very much like a DVD. Next. We can view them linearly. We choose to do so because it makes sense to us, but we could view them backwards if we really wanted to. Next. Now, quantum physics says that every time we make a decision, that there's the many worlds theory, that every time you make a decision, you go in one direction, and then there's a daughter universe that splits off where a copy of you that didn't make that decision goes on. Okay, so next slide. It's kind of captured in a movie that really made no pretenses about talking about quantum physics, but still, Sliding Doors. A London woman's love life and career hinge on whether or not she catches a train, and you get to see it both ways. Next slide. I covered this in a book called Meaning of Everything that's available on barnesandnoble.com. Next. Perhaps we're looking at the human journey the wrong way. So I have one final question for you. Next. Are we living in a simulation? Elon Musk says yes. Nick Bostrom, a philosopher, makes a very compelling argument in the bibliography. David Brin is a physicist at UCI and also a science fiction writer who thinks it's very possible. Next. Is there evidence of this? Next. Yes, there is. There's something possibly. It's called the Mandela effect. During the 1980s, tens of thousands of people reported they had read the newspaper or seen TV stories that Nelson Mandela had just died. It turned out he hadn't. So why this mass delusion? Well, some scientists say it could be evidence of a glitch in the simulation. Next slide. I highly recommend this movie, The Mandela Effect. A man becomes obsessed with facts and events that have been collectively misremembered, okay? And that leads him to question reality itself. Well worth seeing. So let me summarize now. Next. What makes us human? Next. We're curious, but so are other animals. Next. We're tribal, but so are chimpanzees and other animals. Next. We protect the family unit, so do elephants. Next. We're aggressive, and so are tigers and lions. Next. We do appear to have a desire for Maslow's higher level needs, including a need for life to have meaning. Next. And we have self-consciousness. We have created religions, or religions have been created for us to comfort us over the specter of approaching death of ourselves and our loved ones. Next. Now, the Dalai Lama says basically, we're not machines because we have feelings and experience, and we need human affection. Donald Brown wrote a fascinating book in which he identified 67 human behaviors. You may argue about one or two, but still, gift giving, joking, religious ritual, soul concepts, eschatology, or thinking about life after death, hairstyles, body adornment, and so forth. Next. Otto Spengler looked in large patterns like the decline of Western civilization. And he said, when it comes to human behavior, man is the only being that knows death. All others become old, but with a consciousness only limited to the moment, which must seem to them eternal. This knowledge instills the essentially human fear in the presence of death, that every religion, every scientific investigation, every philosophy proceeds from it. Okay, finally, next slide. We'll leave the final word to Faulkner in his Nobel Prize-winning speech, accepting speech. He said, I believe, and I can't do his Southern accent, so you'll have to imagine it. I believe that man will not merely endure, he will prevail. He is immortal, not because he alone among creatures has an inexhaustible voice, but because he has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance. And with that, I think we probably have time for some questions. Next.
If people want to drop any questions in the chat, we can also use the raised hand feature. Well, I did see a couple questions come through. One was about reincarnation teachings. You want to address that one?
Yeah, it's interesting. There have been a lot of books written on the subject. The research done at University of Virginia focuses on whether or not people are having simply biochemical reactions or whether something's really happening. And what they're trying to do with reincarnation is they ask people for specific facts. Okay. Person says they remember being a young boy living in Missouri and so forth. So they ask them for specific facts, and then they basically look to see if there's any way that they can identify how else this person might know some of these facts. So that's the kind of research they're doing to try to identify reincarnation stories that are plausible in contrast to near-death experiences. Okay.
Thank you. There was another in the chat here from Fred Shatsky about how do anthropologists distinguish with these large gaps of time, 176,000 versus 175,000? How does that work?
A lot of times they're using carbon dating to kind of narrow it down to specific time frames. So that's the primary way they do it. And they can distinguish between, a lot of times between Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon simply by the skeletons, which the skulls are going to be different. So.
Another question I'll pull from the chat. This was about, chemicals and radiation. So things that are kind of happening on Earth today that weren't happening 175,000 years ago. What are some of the current things and how they affect us versus what would have affected people way back when?
Well, according to Scott Solomon's book, Future Humans, Evolution, he has a chapter devoted specifically to the environment and the fact that we have more genetic mutations today. Now, they could be from a number of things. There's some mutations caused by the sun. It can cause some. There's some from radiation, obviously. It could be the water we're drinking. It's more polluted. So there are a number of reasons, but it seems to be affecting us specifically, unfortunately, in our Y chromosome more than any other area. It seems to be weaker. I mean, we all know that women are stronger than men, but the Y chromosome is not as strong as the X chromosome. It used to have hundreds of genes, and for what I understand, it's down to a much lower number right now. So it's kind of declining. Okay.
I believe, Geeta, did you have a question?
Hi, Stan.
Hey, Geeta.
It's always fascinating to listen to you because you just open up a world of possibilities that I hadn't even thought about. And now my brain is like on overload, and I'm thinking about, oh my goodness, is it going to be a world with mostly women in the future, and what are we going to look like? And
yeah.
Or
as far as the Y chromosome, we think with the mole that the genes associated with sex moved over to other areas. So in effect, you still have male moles. So it's not quite doom and gloom, but there's really serious research going on in terms of uploading our consciousness. If you look at the book I mentioned, there are companies that now are offering this service. I mean, they're freezing people. Whether they can revise the brain is another question, but there is belief that by 2040 or so, we will be able to actually freeze a brain and revive the consciousness and probably upload it. We need much better computers. We need some other things, but it's not impossible. Theoretically, it's possible.
Wow. And looking back in your research, is it true that there's always been that awareness of the physical being versus the spiritual being or soul, or is that in recent human history?
Yeah. Well, the anthropologist that I read said that it's a hallmark of human culture to have a sense of transcendence. Now, for a number of reasons, they said. One is the feeling that you want to believe that there's another world after this, obviously. Secondly, and that you'll see your loved ones again and so forth. But also, you want there to be retribution for those that you hate. you want to believe that, that the justice prevails eventually. So there's that sense. But the fact that 176,000 years ago, Neanderthals, who we assume to be so primitive, were doing some kind of ritual that appeared to have religious connotations, suggests that it goes way, way, way back.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the point. And by the way, for those of you who don't know Geeta, her brain would never explode. She's a very good lawyer, so she's got a pretty big brain. So
thank you.
Any others? Well, I want to thank everyone for coming, and I look forward to seeing some of you in the near future.
Thank you so much. I also want to share with everyone, similar to what Gita said, having so much information. Stan, again, has put together a post-event reading list that I will send out to everyone, along with, it'll come in a few hours, it'll come with a link to this recording. If you have any friends or family members or people that you feel would benefit from seeing today's presentation, you can send them that with the reading list. And then you can also let them know that I'm sure Stan is on our roster already for next year. We'll have to pull up, what the Thursdays are in 2022, but I can almost guarantee with full certainty that we will always be working with Stan with this series. It's such a delight. And I want to thank everyone on behalf of the Daytimers Committee. We're going to be meeting again online next month with Guri Stark. He's going to be going over some interesting artwork, I believe Chagall, and I think that's what it's going to be, but we will find out. Thank you all so much for being here on behalf of Sima and Lynn and the rest of the committee, and we'll see you all real soon. Bye, everyone.